morning, and let me welcome you all. We're going to start in about 2 or 3 minutes as soon as our participants have reached a quorum, and Christine Scanlon, the CEO of the Keystone Policy Center, will give a warm welcome to begin with. So just a couple more minutes. We definitely have a good quorum, so let's get underway now. Christine Scanlon, who is the president and CEO of the Keystone Policy Center, will give us our welcoming comments.
Thank you so much, Clint. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I think we are mostly all in Washington on what is an overcast, but terrific day to be together. I just want to mention that this is Key Conversations, an ongoing series of conversations and dialogue that the Keystone Policy Center engages with our community on. And we are especially grateful to share the platform today with Dentons and the Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. We have a very appealing title today of COP26, Infrastructure, Build Back Better Act, and other high energy topics, which I can't imagine anything more interesting to be talking about today with our audience. I want to especially thank Clint Bentz, who is the brains and vision behind a number of these sessions. Clint is a former chair of both the Keystone Policy Board of Trustees as well as the Keystone Policy Energy Board, still serves on our executive committee, and we are eternally grateful for Clint and all that he does for our organization. Just briefly, Keystone is based in Keystone, Colorado, with offices here in DC. We have been a nonprofit think tank-esque organization since 1975, focused on the belief that bringing people of diversity of opinion and views together to work through tough issues results in better and longer lasting solutions. And certainly that is modeled by our MC today, Clint Bentz, who chairs Denton's global practice. Clint, we're extremely grateful that you brought this collection of amazing and talented people together, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Christine, for that warm welcome and your very generous comments. I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker, who is the charismatic Arshad Mansour, the president and CEO of EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. Arshad has long been at EPRI, but he has really emerged as, I believe, one of the visionaries of our industry, and somebody that's that I always want to listen to and I always learn from whenever he speaks. Arshad has a master's and doctorate in electrical engineering. He holds 5 US patents I've just discovered in the area of intelligent universal transformers. We've agreed that we're going to give very, very skimpy introductions so that we can really launch into our discussion and also allow the audience plenty of time for Q&A. In that regard, you'll see a Q&A feature on your screen, and what we'll do is hear from Arshad for about 20 minutes, including a very riveting video. And we'll then try to hold about 10 minutes immediately after that for his Q&A. Arshad's got a crazy day today, and he will need to depart after that, but we're so pleased that he could join us for this important presentation. And please don't put your comments into the chat room. That absolutely saturates my ability to moderate and read more than 2 or 3 things at the same time. So Arshad, let me allow you to begin, and we're so glad you're here with us today.
Well, thank you, Clint. You are always too nice. It is always an honor and pleasure. I know I've been participating in a couple of your events, and it's just a privilege to be here because the folks who join the panel, the all-star panelists that you observed, is just an amazing group of individuals that will shape the future of energy. And if you're joining and you don't know EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, that's what we do. We work with 400 entities, energy companies across 40 countries to shape the future of clean energy that's also reliable and affordable. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And coming off the heels of COP26, I had the pleasure and the privilege to be there representing EPRI. And what COP26 to me is, at the end of it, yeah, it's a paper that has been signed by 200 countries. But what it is we're seeing our aspirations for a clean energy future becoming ambitions. And our ambitions are becoming, we are putting stake on the ground, not for 2050, for 2030, near term, on what we want to accomplish as across every country. And when you put a near term aspiration to an ambition target, then the work needs to start right now. And the work needs to start right now of the work that we are continuing, but we will have to accelerate, and we have to think differently and act differently just to meet the 2030 goals. And then we got the 2050 net zero. So with that in mind, I thought, let's start with US. I'm going to have the video that you will see is very US focused. It's talking about what the US target for 2030 is and how ambitious that is, and what are some of the ways we get there. It's a 2.5-minute video. I'm going to peel the onion after the video on some of the 3 key things that we'll have to do in the near term for this 10-year target, and then 2 more things that we'll need to do now to be ready for beyond 2030. So with that as the premise, let's see the video on what it will take for US to reduce emission by 50% economy-wide by 2030.
The Electric Power Research Institute is examining the pace of U.S. carbon emission reduction based on the goal of cutting economy-wide emissions in half by 2030. Across the U.S. economy, annual energy-related carbon emissions declined 1 gigaton between 2005 and 2020, driving CO2 about 50% below 2005 levels by 2030 means tripling the rate of decarbonization, accelerating from a 1 gigaton reduction over 15 years to 1 gigaton every 5 years. Additional reductions are expected in the decades ahead as the U.S. targets net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. Between 2005 and 2020, the power sector reduced its carbon emissions by 35%, driven by end-use efficiency gains coupled with natural gas and renewables replacing coal. Electric sector reductions will need to accelerate over the coming decade to achieve a 3 times increase in the economy-wide pace, with high solar and wind penetration and advanced low-carbon technologies emerging. Achieving net zero power sector emissions will take time and involve substantial technology innovation to make the transition affordable and reliable. The transportation, buildings, and industry sectors achieved relatively small carbon reductions between 2005 and 2020. These sectors will have to substantially accelerate reductions to meet 2030 goals. Electrification will play a central role. In the decades ahead, transportation, buildings, and industry are expected to continue reducing emissions, powered by electrification, low-carbon fuels, and carbon capture and storage. The development of negative emission technologies will benefit all sectors. The power sector is poised to play a crucial role in realizing the U.S. carbon goals in the coming decades, through direct emission reductions and by enabling reductions in transportation, buildings, and industry. As part of EPRI's society-focused mission, the Institute is driving collaborative innovation essential to a clean, affordable, and reliable energy future.
You saw when you see the video, yes, we have 1,100 researchers and we're all geeks, but we also have a couple of folks who does a great job in putting together videos. What this video does is not just for US, but globally, There are a couple of things in the video that is applicable globally. So for example, even to meet the 2030 target by any of the countries that have set up, especially the developed country, power sector, electric sector alone cannot do that. You need to bring in the transportation sector, and you need to bring in the buildings and industry. But power sector will be the tip of the spear, and electricity will need to continue to be clean. But we have to be very careful on how fast we want to clean that electricity. Because if we go too fast, too soon, affordability will be impacted, reliability will be impacted, and that will not be good for transportation and buildings and industry sector. But if you look at just the near-term goal, the 3 times acceleration, going to 50% economy-wide, there are 3 primary things that has to happen. There's a lot of other things that will need to happen. So let me just kind of unpack the 3 things, and these are needed across the globe, not just in US. First, we can't reimagine the grid. We have to build the reimagined grid that is ready for renewables and that is ready for EV. What does that mean? So let's take renewables, wind and solar. To meet our 2030 goal, we need to make sure that the largest source of carbon-free energy, nuclear and hydro, are working online and they're staying. But we'll need to add a lot more wind and solar. Our model shows that anywhere between 3x to 4x. What it means is from 200 gigawatt installed capacity today to 600 to 800 gigawatt installed capacity. The cost of wind and solar, even though we are seeing because of supply chain related impact, the cost is going up a bit, it will continue to go down. Not at the same pace, but it will go down. In order to make the grid ready for that amount of renewables, the first thing, and that's a policy thing, not a technology thing, we have to double or triple the pace at which we are adding transmission, because if you don't add transmission, you're not going to bring in 600 gigawatt of wind and solar. So that's a policy issue, that's a regulatory issue. If we don't address that, we will not be able to reach 50% decarbonization. Second, when we bring a 600 gigawatt or 800 gigawatt of wind and solar, it's a very different resource mix. We are also seeing what happened in Texas, what's happening in Europe, that weather is becoming more extreme and those extreme weathers are happening more frequently. So in order to get the grid ready for that level of renewables, another thing we'll have to do, we'll have to rethink what resource adequacy means in the way we plan our power system. Resource adequacy means we will have resources that are available not just seasonally during the peak winter or peak, the summer season, but on an hour by hour basis. The resources are available when we have common mode failures like what we saw in Texas. The resources are there for the new weather pattern that we are seeing. If you look at what's happening in Europe now, it's not the fault of wind, and it's not the fault of the gas, or they're not bringing in gas. It's the fault or inability to plan that we do have a wind drought. What you're seeing happening in Europe is a wind drought. It's a wind drought that's more than 60 days. Our planning process did not bake that in. We use a 1 in a 10-year loss of load probability that is no longer sufficient. So we have embarked, EPRI, with working with NERC, working with Department of Energy, and more than 30 utilities to kind of rethink what are the planning processes needed for this decade and what are the tools we need to do the plan. I know it's not a technology, but addressing resource adequacy and in parallel addressing markets so that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, there is enough market incentive for people to keep their capacities is going to be critical. We have to be thoughtful on how the natural gas will be a key player even in this decade. When we say that US emission was reduced by 1 gigaton, 2/3 of that happened because of coal to gas conversion. We see more coal to gas conversion in this decade, but we're seeing industries, large chemical industries, petroleum industries that use petroleum as the raw material are thinking of switching to natural gas. This will allow the industry to do the same thing that electric sector did. By going from coal to gas, you reduce by 50%. By going from petroleum to natural gas, industry has the opportunity to do that to 50%. But on the EV side, the biggest challenge is also not technology, it's regulatory. We fully expect within 3 years' time, by 2025, there will be first cost parity, which means when you go and buy a car, a $20,000 car, an EV would be at the same price. It will open the door to EV for what I call the average US household, family of 4 with $45,000 income that has 2 cars. If they are able to convert both their cars to electric, net on their energy bill, they will save $1,000. And that's how this transition can be affordable to the people who can least afford it. But they will not be able to do that unless there is ubiquitous charging infrastructure in those locations. And right now, if you look at the way charging infrastructure are happening, yes, you get it in affluent neighborhoods, but you don't get it in underprivileged places. And we need a societal focus. Utilities will play a role, manufacturers will play a role, but charging infrastructure needs to be ubiquitous. Fleet charging in highways needs to be ubiquitous. You'll hear from NYPA what the NYPA is doing on making it ubiquitous. And that is more of a policy than a technology. But from a technology perspective, there's another key thing we'll need to do to make this grid ready for renewables and EV. As we know, we will need balancing resource. We'll have to balance the variability. Is the balancing resource going to come from batteries, gas turbines? Yes, they will. But let's rethink and see how we can get some of the balancing resources from customer resources. This is the decade where a lot of work on demand response that has happened over past decades becomes a reality of what we call a shared energy economy model. What is a shared energy economy model? You know Uber, you know Airbnb. It is a shared economy model. If I have a house and I have a room and I don't need it and you need it, you pay me, but you get to use the room. Same thing on a car. Same thing on the energy industry. If I have a water heater that breaks, maybe I can get a water heater from the utility or from a third party that is grid ready so that I get it at half the price and I use it for my hot water, but the grid use it for the flexibility. This is not just hot water heater. This is air conditioners. This is, we can put a charging station, 240 volt, which costs $1,500 in a house. And as long as the smart charging, they are agreeing to the smart charging, that's a flexible resource. We talk about resiliency because we have to build the grid resiliently, but resiliency is not only about resource adequacy and transmission and distribution. You know, look at all your cities. If you have traffic lights, when you have power that goes out, traffic accidents is actually a cause. You know, it's a top 5 cause of death and injury. Why can't we put a 10 kilowatt, 8-hour storage across every major traffic intersection all over US? And 99.99% of the time, those resources are the grid resource. But the one time when the power goes out, when we have a storm, that is also providing traffic light for the people. So you can take these examples across many, many areas. This load flexibility enabled by a shared energy economy model, which we have done. We have done virtual power plant pilots. We have done demand response. We do demand response today, but it needs to be ubiquitous. When that $45,000 average US household customer's water heater breaks, they do not have the emergency fund to replace it, but they have to. At that time, if they know already that, hey, I can get a water heater at $1,000 less cost because the utility has partnered with third-party aggregators, it's grid ready, then you're not only reducing the $1,000 energy bill, but you're reducing the capital cost that average customer has to pay to replace their water heater, to replace their air conditioner. And this shared energy economy model will be absolutely paramount to make sure that we are getting an EV renewable ready grid. It's not just the grid. And come to the last point, all these two things are predicated by a comprehensive communication infrastructure that electric sector have to rethink, and they're already rethinking. Ameren, Evergy, Southern Company, San Diego Gas and Electric, I can keep on naming. So what does it mean? What it means is if you have to enable customer flexible resource, if communities have microgrid that is part of flexibility, if fleet operators have batteries that are resiliency resource for their transportation, but flexibility resource for the grid, you need ubiquitous communication. And communication technology, whether it's LTE, 5G, if you look at it, it's progressing at a pace that this is a reality. But before we add another communication infrastructure, if you look at any utility, anywhere between 20 to 25 different types of special purpose communication infrastructure exists today. We do it for AMI, we do it for recloser control, we do it for distribution automation, we do microwave on the transmission. This is an opportunity to rethink that architecture. and actually come up with a communication architecture that has the latency, that has the security, that can support multiple applications. And you will hear about that. This journey to reimagine the grid, the fact that in order to make the grid ready for EV, get ready for renewables, I think communication will play a key role. Interoperability of devices that goes from one region to another will play a key role. So if we can do all those three things, if we change the policy to make sure we can build transmission line quickly, if we change the policy so that we are not just looking at electric bill as energy affordability, it's the energy bill which is energy affordability, that's electric, gas, and gasoline, then we have an opportunity. As technologists, I'm always optimistic that we can reduce 50% economy-wide emission. Let me just end up with, so yes, let's say in 2030, we're all there and we have another conference like this, and we have been successful in US and maybe in many other parts of the world. Well, now we got to go to net zero. We are at 50%. What do? Should we continue to focus on energy efficiency? Yes. Should we continue to clean the electric sector? Yes. Should we bring in more clean carbon generation technologies? Yes. But even if we do all those things, we will not be close to reaching net zero, because technologies are needed, not just by the power sector. How do you decarbonize shipping? How do you decarbonize large industry? How do you decarbonize airlines? And this is where we have the unique opportunity for doubling down on innovation, for turbocharging innovation this decade. So before this decade is over, we should have the ability for new clean energy molecules that would be made from clean electricity that would help us to go to the glide path to net zero. And one of those clean molecules that you hear about is hydrogen. Using clean electricity to bring hydrogen. Use our plentiful natural gas resource in the US with carbon capture and storage to build hydrogen. That hydrogen could be powering the next generation gas turbine. And you don't have to imagine that. The first commercially operational gas turbine, an LM6000 plant that NYPA has at Brentwood. We are working with GE and we are working with Air Liquide to start the process of looking at what will it take to go from 5% blending to 30% blending. What are the impact on temperature? What are the impact on NOx emission? That's the type of engineering work that will be needed. And if you have a chance, just Google these 4 words, low carbon resource initiative, and you'll go to our website. We'll see a lot of documents on this innovation, advanced nuclear, carbon capture. So in this decade to end, we're not only working to reduce to 50%, and that's not an easy task, but we are also working on the innovation so that tools are ready by 2030 to get to the net zero glide path. So that's overall, I think hopefully less than 20 minutes kind of give a picture on US, and many of these elements are equally applicable to any other country that has set up ambitious goals. Clint, with that, I'm going to give it back to you and be happy to answer questions. And if I don't answer the questions or cannot, we have a panelists that are a whole lot more knowledgeable than I am, and I'm sure they will.
Thank you. Hello. Hello.
Your audio is working.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. Let me ask Brian and John to open up my video as well, please.
See you, Clint. We can see you.
Oh, really? There we go. Well, Arshad, we were really hoping for we had big expectations for your vision statement, and you certainly did not disappoint today. That was really spectacular. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions, and again, invite the audience to come in on the Q&A feature of our platform. I guess the first thing I would ask you, I've heard you say that we lost at least a decade, maybe more, on preparing for climate. And we've seen your video indicating all that we have to do to accelerate. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? How do you handicap our ability to accomplish the 3 points that you just highlighted?
I think we will have to make sure that as we are doing this glide path, we are also very careful of this whole, the climate and climate related effects. We are seeing it today. So as we are decarbonizing, imagine you're in 2040 and you have 2 cars that are electric. Your expectation on grid resiliency would be a whole lot more than today. So as we are building this decarbonization, we have to look into the resiliency piece with the same degree of rigor. And that's an area, if we don't do that, look what happened in Texas. Look what's happening in Europe. Gas price is $40 a million BTU. If the customer gets those price shock, the reliability shock, the number of deaths that happened in Texas, then we will not be able to continue the journey, because public society will not want to do a transition if it is not reliable, not affordable, and not equitable.
Arshad, on those points, we see, you pointed out Texas, where more than 200 people died, 4.5 million Texans without electricity and some without water for several days. Europe, we see the wind drought, I think is your term. And also California last summer had rolling blackouts. The Gulf Coast was hit, it's been hit by several major hurricanes, most recently Ida, which has really challenged their whole grid system as well as resource adequacy. We're going to cover that with some of our panelists in a few moments, but I really share your concern about the need to accelerate on resilience just as quickly as we accelerate on decarbonization. What type of, you mentioned the need for regulatory change with respect to EVs, I think also transportation. Can you give us a couple of quick high-level points on what changes you would like to see?
Well, I think on the EV side, build before EVs are coming in, and build it in a way so these are infrastructures that will last for 15, 20 years, not for just 3-5 years. I go back to the days in 1935, 38. We decided as a society that electricity is a better form of energy, and we will bring electricity to the masses. And that was the Rural Electrification Act. That resulted in, it doesn't make any economic sense. It didn't make any economic sense in 1935 to build a 100-mile long line to serve 4 farmers, but we did it because that's the right thing to do. So deploying EV charging infrastructure for the masses is not going to be a market-based solution like we have on gas stations. It has to be done deliberately. Cities, federal utilities will need to have a role in play. We could still have great thriving competition for different type of charging infrastructure that will come in. So it's not a monopoly, but those charging infrastructure have to talk with each other. Interoperability will be key. So I think policy that enables interoperability, policy that enables that the benefit cost may not be there. There was no benefit cost to put a 100-mile long line to serve rural America in 1935, but we did that because that's the right thing to do. And we talked about decarbonization. I didn't even mention air quality. Electrifying transportation, electrifying fleets, electrifying truck and shipyards. And if you look at where the shipyards are, if you look at where the truck stops are, if you map the US and put those locations, they are mostly in disadvantaged communities. They're the one who suffers the air quality. So I think it needs a societal imperative backed by resources in order to make sure that charging infrastructure is ubiquitous and available to the masses, both on the fleet and truck side, because half of the trucks are private operators. They don't have the money to do this. So I think that's that if that doesn't happen, then we will not be able to decarbonize even close to that 50% that we think that we have put as a target. Forget about net zero.
Thank you, Arshad. Let me ask you another question before we move into our panel discussion. I know you've got a limited timetable as well. When you talk about the need to turbocharge innovation, what are a couple of the key things that you see on the horizon? You mentioned hydrogen. What other innovation do you see happening quickly enough to help us?
Well, quickly, the innovation will take a little bit of time. These are tools we need more for the glide path to net zero. I would say the biggest opportunity, and this is a US focused, but globally applicable, is Reimagine nuclear power plant. We are seeing a lot of resource interest engagement in what we call advanced nuclear, a molten salt, high temperature, 100 megawatt nuclear reactor that we will have operational this decade. And there is resources to do that from DOE through the infrastructure bill. It's the perfect resource to provide flexibly either hot heat, steam, or hydrogen or electricity whenever you need it. And those are the type of resources where we have to turbocharge innovation. Producing, using, transporting hydrogen at a lower cost is where we will have to turbocharge innovation. Making carbon capture and storage actually work at scale and make sure that we are doing it in the right way so that we are not storing carbon in places where the disadvantaged communities are without the proper precaution. That's where the innovation will come. And we are optimistic. The infrastructure bill, if you peel the onion, the amount of resources for these innovations are more than 3x. This is a 5x to 10x increase in resources going in for those innovations. So as technologists and researchers, we are absolutely thrilled to see that happening.
Thank you, Arshad. And that's a perfect setup for our panel, which we have, as you mentioned, 5 really exceptional industry CEOs. We're going to start with Karen Wayland, who will be able to talk about your last point with considerable authority. And let me ask our full panel to open up their TV screens now. And I really invite you to have an interactive discussion with each other as we progress. And then we will open up the Q&A feature for our audience and receive their questions as well. And I'll introduce each of our panelists just before I begin asking questions. Arshad, we so appreciate your being with us today, especially given all of the other commitments you've got today. And I just want to say that was really an extraordinary job. And
thank you. It's an honor and pleasure.
We will see you soon. Thank you, Arshad. And Karen Wayland has a similarly complex schedule. She has just joined us, stepping out of her own Grid Connect conference, which if you're not able to see parts of it, you should really see the recording of it because she has assembled an exceptional group of speakers and always does a great job with that conference. Karen is the president and CEO of the GridWise Alliance. She is a veteran of energy and legislative affairs and really our think tank's go-to person when we want to know what's really happening on Capitol Hill, what the likelihood of change is, what the likelihood of passage of important legislation will be, and what the impact of that legislation will be. Karen, part of her expertise comes from having worked with Speaker Pelosi as well as Senator Harry Reid when he was whip before becoming the majority leader. And she also logged some important time at the Department of Energy, including with former Secretary Ernie Moniz. She is a key author, for example, of the Quadrennial Energy Review piece that touched on or addressed directly grid modernization. Also, Karen is wicked smart. She has a Master of Science degree, but also a PhD in geochemistry, a dual PhD, geochemistry and natural resources. Karen, I know that you'll be with us just for a short time today and will need to leave shortly after your presentation. I'll ask you 1 or 2 quick questions just so we can elaborate a little bit and before we move in with our other panelists. But thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you for letting me drop in and out. I wish I could stay longer. You have a great lineup.
So, Karen, what are the most important features of the Infrastructure Act as they relate to grid modernization? And I know that you were integral in shaping many of those features. And I see Rob Schwartz nodding his head, because we who have worked with you closely on that have seen the extraordinary job you've done.
Well, it was an enormous industry-wide effort to develop recommendations for Congress and to advocate to Congress for those investments that they put into the infrastructure package. I worked, as you mentioned, Speaker Pelosi during the Recovery Act, and there was probably about $10 billion, sort of very broadly speaking, in terms of what was available for the grid. And back then, they considered all their storage programs, which are really important to the grid, as part of this grid modernization effort. When I add up what's in the infrastructure package, that is just sort of, separate from all the storage incentives, separate from battery recycling, separate from clean energy incentives, the grid package itself is historic, on the order of maybe close to about $20 billion. And if you look at the amount of money that's available in the broadband area, which is a separate part of the bill that doesn't flow to DOE, there are more billions that are available for the utility industry to make investments in utility communication. So there's $11 billion for different kinds of resilience programs. There's $3 billion for grid flexibility. There's an increased funding for cybersecurity, although we'll be working to increase that number further. And there's a whole suite of other sets of investments for electric vehicles and, like I said, batteries and other things that are really enabling programs to help the grid evolve to be this platform for decarbonization.
Karen, we know that Build Back Better is a central focus at the moment. How do you handicap the likelihood of passage? And if it does pass, what are some of the key features that we should know about?
So I have been watching Congress debate the reconciliation package for, close to not quite a year, but, somewhere on there. And I keep saying, I'm so glad I don't work on the Hill anymore. That's not my problem to figure out how it's going to move. But I think there's a huge commitment to move something. And then the question is, in the energy space, how much is there for energy? I believe that no matter what, if the clean energy payment program, performance program falls out, there's still significant money for the utility industry, for the clean energy industry, in the form of tax credits. And there's some modeling that I've heard DOE did that shows that those tax credits would actually significantly decarbonize the power sector. And so there is in that reconciliation package, Build Back Better, billions of dollars more for EVs and EV charging infrastructure, and more for transmission. I will say that we were a little disappointed that there was not any more money for the distribution system, because so much of what's envisioned to be transformative, there's port infrastructure, as Arshad mentioned, and a whole suite of other things that get plugged into the grid. We were hoping for more money in investing in the grid itself to provide the flexibility to accommodate all of these things. But again, this will accelerate the need to make those investments in the grid, and I think those investments will flow.
And we're also seeing tremendous opportunity for tax credits for renewables moving forward, which will, as Arshad pointed out, it's essential for the decarbonization goals that have been articulated in COP26 and beyond, but it's also going to place a lot of stress on the grid. What are you focused on in terms of some of your challenges and potential solutions to maintain resilience?
Well, I think, I think helping DOE think through the best way to implement the resilience funding, the $11 billion of resilience funding, in a way that helps de-risk the decisions that policymakers, particularly regulators, have to make about the impacts on ratepayers. So one of the crucial issues that we are going to focus on is how DOE will structure those programs in a way. Some of them are split between DOE funding and state funding. how will you work with the states to set up the rules, to set up the kinds of eligibility so that states really can have the flexibility to address the big resilience issues, the big needs, because of course resilience needs differ, geographically, and also thinking through how to make sure that we have a lot of data on reliability and the impacts of investments on reliability. We have growing sets of data on the impacts of resilience investments and the benefits of those resilience investments, but it is a little more difficult to make the benefit cost pencil out for pure resilience investments. So I think that one of our goals in advocating for federal funding across this grid space was really to help ease the kinds of decisions and accelerate the decisions at the state, local level to make this transition happen.
And Karen Arshad mentioned that one of the great obstacles to moving forward on the grid is not simply technology. A lot of the technology will be available to us, but also regulation. If you could wave your wand, what types of regulatory change would you like to see with respect to transmission?
Transmission. Well, there's a sort of a three-legged stool. There's the cost allocation, the siting and permitting, and actually it's more than the three-legged stool these days. I think that we just had FERC Commissioner Allison Clemens speaking to us this morning and really focused on transmission. What I think we need to make sure is that the focus is not only on new transmission, but on how to alleviate some of the constraints on existing transmission through grid enhancing technologies so that we don't have to wait the many years, even if in the best of circumstances, the Biden administration could smooth out all of the interagency processes for building new transmission. We are going to need new transmission capacity before we can get a lot of new transmission lines built. And so I think we'd like to see a kind of a dual focus on how do you get new technologies deployed, as well as our members are all looking to be customers of that new transmission. But I think really figuring out how we value the services of these new technologies in a way that makes those benefit costs pencil out in the short term so that we can quickly increase capacity of the transmission system will be important. And I think that there's a move at DOE to address some of the seams issues that are projects that can easily be with some energy behind them, a little shoulder energy on the part of the administration, will really make a difference in the medium term in terms of building out our transmission capacity.
Thank you, Karen. We're going to give you a chance to leap ahead of our other panelists with my lightning round question to you. And I would just ask, I know you need to get back to your own conference. If you were
which several of your panelists are sponsors.
Great. To your point, one of the things that our client CEOs are expressing a lot of concern about is if we do need to your point, if we do need to increase renewables by 3 to 4x in the next 10 years or so, we really are going to have to make very significant changes to our transmission system and our communications system related to the grid. And Rob is going to cover that in a moment. But for your lightning round question, what is really the essential point that you would like to convey to this audience in just a couple of sentences?
Well, we actually asked our members in a conference about emerging technologies what one of the fundamental backbones of a modern grid would be, and from the small rural utility all the way up to the major independent or IOUs, the answer was an upgraded communication network. And so I think that we're beginning to see a lot more attention be paid to the fundamental role that communication networks, whether it's wireless, whether it's broadband, are going to play in the smart grid, smart cities, and really having a grid that is flexible and responsive enough to deal with the increased amount of renewables.
Thank you so much,
and
Karen. I know
Rob did not pay me to say that.
Well, it's really a perfect introduction Rob, who will be our next speaker. And thank you, really,
Thank you.
from all
Wish
of
I
us
could stay.
for coming in. We
No
understand.
quality on, Justin. All right. Thank you very much for letting me drop in and out. Take care.
That's spectacular. Thank you, Karen. And Rob, you have been given perfect setups by both Arshad and Karen. Rob is the president and CEO of Antarex, which is bringing spectrum and private LTE networks to the utility industry. There's a phenomenal article in Forbes today regarding Antarex that Llewellyn King, one of my favorite energy journalists, has written. And it really shows a spotlight on some of the key goals of Antarex and what they hope to bring to the utility industry, very much in keeping with the urging of Arshad and Karen. Rob has had several senior positions in the telecommunications industry. He was actually discovered or spotted early in his career by Morgan O'Brien, who is the founder and executive chairman of Antarex, but also was the legendary visionary who founded Nextel and helped bring broadband wireless to the US in a ubiquitous way. And Rob was their head of corporate development at that time. So Morgan just cherry-picked his best and brightest to be CEO of Antarex. Also, Rob has a degree in finance from Wharton, and I've probably learned more from Rob and Morgan about finance and taking an idea and growing it and making it happen and moving from a startup company to a more than $1 billion company overnight. And I think they will clearly move way beyond that very, very quickly. So Rob, why don't we start with Arshad's key point, and that is you can't modernize the grid without modernizing communications. Can you explain that to us a little more carefully?
I definitely, Clint. Thank you, Clint, for that introduction, and thank you, Dentons, for hosting us, and Karen and Gridwise as well, and Christine as well with Keystone's efforts. And the toughest place to be, Clint, is always following Arshad, and then you gave me the double whammy with Karen. I would describe as a mic drop moment for me twice. Where they clearly delivered a lot of the important information that I wanted to share with this audience today. Look, for us at Antarex, as you said, we really are applying our deep knowledge of solving industrial communications needs from our experience at Nextel, and applying that now and working with a large number of utilities, over 50 at this point, to really help them modernize their communications to support this modernized grid that Arshad sketched out so well, right? All of the changes we all know are happening and that must occur. It's not an optional question anymore. Our focus is on that third leg of the stool, as Arshad laid out his platform, about assuring that utilities, both individually and importantly collectively, because this is a nationwide challenge that we're facing, have the ability to build the kind of communications that are resilient, that are affordable, and that have the security requirements to be able to solve very, very critical use cases. And so that includes, we've got partner utilities working on wildfire mitigation, right? The ability to know when a tree falls on a limb, when a line breaks, and the time it takes between when it breaks and it hits the ground to depower that line. And the communications technologies, as was said earlier, exist, but the availability of both the spectrum, which is the asset that we bring forward as Antarex, as well as the ability to understand how to deploy this and solve these kind of use cases. We want to make that available, not just individually, but collectively to the industry. We've spent a lot of time with Clint's help and really everybody's help that I see here on this panel, to be honest, in driving forward the collective wisdom of how we should approach this problem. Because what we noticed when we started this effort years ago and went around visiting utilities and talking to experts is that everyone was focused on solving the same problem, kind of simultaneously inventing solutions to the issue. What we said was this needs to be a collective effort. And so we initially launched something called the Utility Broadband Alliance that was hosted by a number of founding member utilities and industry technology leaders. That's now blossomed into its own standalone organization that's working with utilities across the nation, and just had a recent event hosted by Ameren in St. Louis, where there were over in this difficult time over 300 people there, really focusing on how do we use communication technology, as Arshad talked about, to really drive key use cases. I talked about wildfire mitigation, but for us to reach our renewable goals, to reach distributed energy integration, sensors, situational awareness, and using that data to make important and critical actions, that's going to require a significant increase in the communications capabilities. And really what we're driving is using LTE, which is long-term evolution, the same technology that the phone in all of your pockets uses. And the evolution is that evolves into 5G as it's needed by the industry. And so that's really what our key focus is. For us, what's really important, I think, as we approach this, is that there is this collective effort that I talk about. We see the network across the country as this nationwide network of networks. When you interconnect we're currently working with San Diego Gas and Electric, with Ameren, with Evergy, their neighbor, and other utilities. Southern Company has deployed LTE. The issues that are faced and the collective effort to be able to figure out the best technology drive vendors to be interested in this. We just announced, and Clint, thank you for referencing the article in Forbes. We put together something called the Antarex Active Ecosystem Program. Now over 70 companies that are collectively helping drive the ecosystem, only because we've defined this as a collective effort. It used to be that individual utilities were trying to get vendors to help them do things. Now that we have the collective vision in this sandbox, in this Active Ecosystem Program, we've got companies like Cisco and Motorola and GE and Nokia, Burns & McDonnell, Black & Veatch, the list goes on. And now we just launched a subset of that committee, a new effort to specifically drive a focus on cybersecurity. We call it the Antarex Security Collective, and that's what Llewellyn King focused on in that most recent article. Because recognizing the complexity facing utilities and addressing the security challenges, we wanted to be able to bring that collective action together as well. And communications is such a critical piece, right? The number of sensors that we're seeing utilities planning to deploy within their infrastructure to be able to be aware of what's happening, both from a cyber standpoint and obviously an operational standpoint, is it's mind-blowing. Millions and millions of sensors. And so the ability to make sure that also brings the layer of cybersecurity that's required uniquely by utilities as they deploy and operate their own communications networks. Utilities aren't new to private communications. It's been something they've been doing for decades because of the necessity to be able to keep the level of operational control and security. And so now we're really helping it take that to the next level. Again, this modern grid requires these modern communications.
Rob, on that last point, and I know the Forbes article talked about not just the ecosystem for suppliers, but also the subset on security. Can you describe in a little more detail, how does a private LTE network assist in a utility's cybersecurity protection? When we look at the industry surveys now, the things that are keeping utility CEOs up at night are cybersecurity, extreme weather and turbulent weather, and really resource adequacy. how, in simple terms, how does a private LTE network help?
Sure. Well, the first thing is the word private in private LTE, and really that stands for a network that's owned, built, operated by utilities, the way they need it, in the places they need it, and with the level of resiliency and security as you talked about. And so private says that, unlike using an off-the-shelf commercial product, no one else is going to have access to that network. You're air gapping it, you're firewalling that from the public internet. And so that level of that's sort of the level one of making sure that it's cyber secure. And then that the information that flows through that. And that's where, the initial 6 companies that we pulled together in this Antarex Security Collective are focused on things like cyber threat intelligence and zero trust security, data authentication. It's those elements, right? And as the threat becomes quantum, right? The speed at which computers can be moving to be able to come at these challenges from domestic and foreign sources. How are we aware that they're there, and how do we have the level of automation? Starting with first sensing and then the ability to make decisions. And so, Clint, it's the availability of that secure private network to monitor all the assets. And we're in an environment where we're talking about, as we just heard from Arshad, of the deployment of a lot more assets into this network, that each of them is going to have a level of interaction with both the incumbent utility, but also there's going to be third parties operating those. And the way in which we're going to secure that environment is critical, and therefore the communications piece. It's not the only silver bullet, right? This is going to be an organic process that's going to continue to evolve. But having a network like LTE, and if you think about sort of the phone in your pocket, the beauty of LTE, unlike the historical systems that a lot of utilities and all of us use, right? We used to have within utilities, there's a lot of single point communication systems that were deployed to solve single problems. Just like we used to have all kinds of different devices that now are all consolidated into that LTE phone in your pocket. The ability to Ameren, in our example, when we deployed with them, they now are planning to consolidate over 20 different existing legacy networks onto their single LTE network. And what does that do? You then have a single, resilient, secure network, one network to monitor, one network to control, assure you have a level of security, deploying security layers at your needs, where you need it, how you need it, and being able to monitor and control that, not relying on a third party to do so. We think that's critical to be able to reach the cybersecurity requirements, and honestly critical to reach the modernization requirements of deploying such a vast number of assets into our utility infrastructure.
And just the air gap alone between commercial carriers and private utility networks will save a tremendous amount of potential intrusion, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, commercial networks are essential in our nation, right? Having been a commercial network operator at Nextel, they serve a very important purpose for mobile communications, for industrial communications. But when it comes to the customized needs of utilities, and this isn't a new idea, utilities again have been deploying private networks for their own specific needs in places where commercial networks aren't available. I talked about wildfire mitigation, where we're working with San Diego Gas and Electric. They have wildfire regions where there aren't people, where there are trees and power lines and substations that they have to monitor, but you can't get cellular access in those places. And so the essential nature of having a cost-efficient way of deploying this technology in those areas, and that's part of the cost efficiency here with LTE. This is now the global standard. Every wireless operator around the globe has standardized on LTE, which means you have a choice of a very competitive environment of manufacturers, and there's a robust ecosystem of devices and software and solutions and security elements. And so we're focusing that ecosystem now specifically to focus on helping utilities drive their solution set, and that's where we think we're the really important part of bringing the solution forward. Great
discussion, Rob, and I hope that as our other panelists get into this discussion, you'll feel free to jump in as we go along, and we'll be coming back to each of you for our lightning round questions, same as we asked Karen. If you think that Rob had a tough job following Arshad and Karen, now poor Jan Vrens has to follow Arshad, Karen, and Rob Schwartz. But the good news is he is totally up to it. And I have known Jan and respected him for many years. He is one of my personal go-to guys, just like Karen and each of you, that I go to when I really want to know what are breaking trends in the industry, what his practical advice is on key things. And we happily work together on many initiatives. Jan is the head of energy, sustainability, and infrastructure for Guidehouse. He is, the firm has more than 1,000 energy projects a year. And Jan presides over about 600 managing professionals today. And I assume that number next month will be even higher, because I know they have a few things in the works. And important to our think tank, Jan co-chairs the technology pillar of the Denton Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. So Jan, let's get started with you. What are you seeing from a practical industry standpoint, your client standpoint, regarding the new Infrastructure Act and prospects under Build Back Better? How do you see that impacting your clients' needs?
Yeah, thanks, Clint, and it's always a pleasure to be on a panel like this. And it's hard to fill the gaps, right? Because so much has been covered already. But a couple of things. First, I want to make a comment about what's happening at the global scale. Arsha touched on it a little bit, but there's over 700 billion euros in the European Commission spent on resiliency and decarbonization of the energy system in Europe. 700 billion. The infrastructure bill in total is about 600, which is it's a lot more than energy. That's physical infrastructure in roads, etc. And Karen did a nice job of lifting the energy piece out of that. It's still a lot, and the practical side of this is we work with our clients now to figure out what are the programs that the federal government is looking at to fund? What are the mechanisms? And it cuts across many of the agencies, right? Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, but also Department of Defense, Department of Interior, and so this will come from multiple agencies. It will then go to state and local level through the states, as well as some of the cities and counties. And then there will be other recipients like utilities and others as well. So there's a lot of money. For the people that remember the Smart Grid Investment Grant, which came out of the Recovery Act in 2009, I use that all the time as an example, because that was $4 billion of grants from the federal government managed by the Department of Energy, and it was matched up to like 8 billion. So in total, it was an 8 billion investment in smart grid, AMI meters, smart devices on the distribution and transmission network. And for those who were there at this time, this was a highly successful program, and it was only 8 million. So I think with the funding that is now in the infrastructure bill and hopefully more in the Build Back Better, I think we have a tremendous opportunity to invest in the grid. I agree with Karen. We need the distribution side, right? So Arshad spoke about clean, reliable, and affordable grid, but we can't forget that it will be a distributed grid as well. The DER side, and Clint, that I've been talking about this for many years. This concept of energy cloud, it is one system, and I know that Justin will talk about that in terms of how they do that in New York, and it is one system from generation, transmission to distribution to behind the meter. It connects the buildings. It connects transportation infrastructure. We're not going to have an energy system and a separate EV charging infrastructure. It's going to be an integrated system, and that's why the behind the meter element and the distribution side of our system is going to be really key, and we need to invest more. By the way, if you look at the investments by utilities in the last couple of years, they have increased specifically on the distribution side and behind the meter side for that reason. We cannot have resources behind the meter that are not integrated into the grid, because that will go that will not help with the affordability, it will not help with the resiliency, and it will not support the needs that clients are having. So it's going to be really exciting. The challenge will be to understand what's in the infrastructure bill, how the money will flow down, and then also, Clint, how cross-sector participants can collaborate, how a utility can collaborate with a city around EV charging infrastructure, and how that then jointly gets funded through maybe some money from federal as well as some of the state rate-based money. So it will be complex, but I'm very, very positive that if we can repeat what we did with the Smart Grid Investment Grant funding in 2009, this will be very impactful.
Thank you, Jan. And you've mentioned distributed energy resources and demand side. You really were one of the earliest pioneers in describing the importance of that. I remember going back years ago now to Aspen Institute and Keystone Policy Center and our own law firm's energy summits. You were kind of ahead of the herd on this. How do you, can you elaborate a little bit more on what you expect to see with distributed energy resources and demand response and how important it is?
Yeah. Again, Arshad spoke about how we need to accelerate large-scale renewables, right? 3x. Distributed energy resources will grow at a faster pace than that. It will grow at a faster pace than central station expansion in the next 10 years. And what we mean by that is things like energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation, behind the meter solar, behind the meter storage, and also electric vehicles. That's also a DER. And I use this example all the time. If 20% of the personal vehicles in the US would be electric, Clint, that would give you 300 gigawatts of battery storage capacity available. Now that's theoretically available. It doesn't mean that it's all the time available, but on average, we use our cars at most 20% of the time. If you think about fleets like school buses, they are available after 4, exactly when the peak starts to kick in into the system. There's a huge opportunity there to use that resource, which is a distributed resource, to help with peak shaving, as well as provide resiliency to the grid as well. So we can't forget the DER side. I know Justin is going to talk about it, so I don't want to take away all his thunder there. But yes, renewables, large scale, wind, solar, absolutely key. But there's as much opportunity on the DER demand side as well. And again, it's one system. It's all integrated. A lot of the DER, is driven not so much by policies and regulations. Some as well, but more by technology, and even more so by customer demands. Customers want solutions that serve their specific needs, and there's a lot of really good ones out there that are behind the meter. And then, a little bit further into the grid, things at the community level, right? Things like microgrids. There's a lot of opportunities there. I'm very excited about energy efficiency. I'm glad that the current administration believes that energy efficiency is important. Will continue to invest in energy efficiency, and I think we're going to see more of that in the Build Back Better bill if that comes to fruition.
Yes, indeed. You mentioned electrification of school buses, for example. Justin and I have been working very, very closely with the World Resources Institute. They received a $100 million grant from the Bezos Earth Fund, which is now run by the former head of the World Resources Institute, Andrew Steer. And we're seeing the acceleration. The goal of that grant is to help develop the electrification of all school buses in the United States.
Yep.
And it's a huge task, and we're seeing it just accelerate as one example of your point on potential for battery storage. we do have the need to develop further technology and innovation on longer duration energy storage. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, quickly on the fleets. Fleet electrification is going to be really key. That's where you find the skill, whether it's school buses or whether it's United Postal Services fleets and things like that. We actually just kicked off a project really exciting with the federal government, with the General Services Administration, and we are looking at fleet electrification for the federal government. 200,000 vehicles, right? That's what we're talking about. How do you electrify a fleet of 200,000 vehicles, and how do you optimize the capacity that is available by having all those batteries plugged into the network? So that's a really exciting new project that we just kicked off. In terms of long duration storage, absolutely. We are very bullish. I have a whole team that is looking at, that has been doing research on storage for a decade, and will continue to do that. We're looking at all the storage manufacturers globally. I'm super excited about long duration storage on one hand, because I think it will become longer and cheaper and provide a lot more capacity. At the same time, we also know that we're not going to get there just with battery storage. And that's where, if you allow me quickly, that's where a renewable fuel comes in play. Ashad mentioned it. We cannot go to a net zero energy system without a renewable fuel in that system. And that is the last piece that to the puzzle, and that will complete that energy system of the future. And it doesn't matter whether it's an electron or a molecule. We will be able to provide clean energy either through electrons or through molecules at that time. But we need more renewable, low carbon fuels into the mix as well. But on long duration storage, a lot of advancement, accelerated pace, similar to short duration, as well as some of the other new technologies. And I think we'll be surprised in the next 3 to 5 years how far batteries can take us, but not all the way.
And to your point on fuel and possible other storage measures derived from ammonia or other issues, yep. We are honored, our law firm's honored to be working with you on Guidehouse's hydrogen consortium, where I think you're doing some groundbreaking work there. I think Justin is a member of that.
I found that as well, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jan. We are going to need to move quickly to get in all our panelists and our Q&A time. Justin Driscoll is the interim president and CEO of the New York Power Authority. He is the New York Power Authority is the largest state-owned electric utility in the country. And Gil Quiñones, the former CEO of NYPA, who has now just become the CEO of Commonwealth Edison, repeatedly over the years has told me what a superstar Justin is within that organization. He has served as their lead legal counsel and the head of many of their key commissions. Justin served also as secretary for the corporate board. He's on a lot of other significant boards, including the Alliance to Save Energy, the Global Energy Council of the World Resources Institute, which is near and dear to my heart. And we're actually doing a webinar on that immediately following this webinar. Our scheduling teams are trying to see how many accomplishments we can achieve today. Justin also serves on the board of the Large Public Power Council and is really emerging at the national level now. He's very well known in the state of New York, but really emerging as a important thought leader. And so we're really thrilled that you are with us, Justin. One of the more interesting things that the New York Power Authority is doing is creating the first end-to-end digital utility. Can you tell us what that means and tell us a little bit about that and your progress on it?
Sure. Thank you, Clint, and thanks to the Keystone Policy Center and Denton for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with this great panel. Just two seconds on NYPA, the New York Power Authority. In addition to being the largest state-owned utility, we own and operate 16 power plants, and we own and operate about 1,400 miles of high voltage transmission. Founded in 1931 by FDR when he was governor, and built out by Robert Moses in the 50s and 60s with our two large hydroelectric facilities, the Niagara Power Project, which is 2,600 megawatts, largest facility in the state, and our St. Lawrence FDR project is about 1,100, both hydro. Niagara, St. Lawrence run of the river, and Niagara being a turbine facility with a reservoir called the Lewiston facility. So it's an interesting entity. We serve largely governmental customers, which makes us unique. Jan and I have talked in the past about just the unique nature of our data set of all the governmental buildings that we serve and how that can be utilized. But and that's a key part of what we're trying to do. So in 2012, 2013, we started to experience some failures in our transformers and other elements of the aging sort of power system. And at the same time, there was a lot of R&D going on in development of accelerated computing power and advanced software and analytics and so forth. So we started to think about what kind of digital commitment we would make as an entity here. And as we continued to work, we saw that this is something that's developing, and everything's going to be digital. So we started a quest to become an end-to-end digital utility, and that kicked off in about 2017. So you asked, what does that mean for us and for our customers? So on the generation and transmission side, it means combining these digital processes, data, technology, and people to drive business insights through the connectivity, big data, and analytics that the technology provides and digitization provides. And for the customers, it means giving them business insights and information that allows them to fully understand their energy supply and demand and lower their costs and increase the productivity of their energy infrastructure and ecosystem. So the digital utility that we're creating has really three pillars. One is what we call our integrated smart operations center. And that basically takes data from our transmission and generation system and feeds it into a central location here in our central office in White Plains. And basically, it's effectively creating digital twins of our generation facilities and our transmission so that we can model real-time performance against what is supposed to be happening, so that ideally we can identify deviations from that and spot problems that can then eliminate unplanned outages. And we've already seen huge savings as a result of the analytics that are taking place from that data flow. The other component is what we call Agile or Innovation Lab for Energy, and this is basically another digital twin, but it's a digital twin of the transmission system that we've modeled. We share it with other utilities and academia, and the idea there is that we can take, it's a closed loop system, so we can take like a proposed wind or solar farm or utility scale farm, solar farm or wind farm, and we can plug it into our model and see what impacts it would have on the grid in performance and congestion and other issues that might develop. So that's been getting a lot of use. That's another component. And then the third is what we call New York Energy Manager, which is the building data set that I mentioned earlier that Jan and I have been talking about, and I know he's interested in. It's just it's a very unique data set of 17,000 governmental buildings Given the nature of our customers, we serve largely governments, municipalities, public.
Justin, you're,
Scale.
there we go. Your screen is frozen just for a moment. Now you're good. You're back. And you just need to unmute.
Was it something I said?
I think just a little internet demon for you, but
yeah. So just on the buildings, 17,000 governmental buildings. We can help them. We can help them analyze their energy use. We can also do our own analytics. It's just it's really been very valuable, and another thing that makes this digital journey unique. And on the sensor side, let's talk about sensors. We currently have 80,000 sensors deployed across our system, and we're looking to go to 130, 140 sensors, 140,000 sensors. So that's it's just really exciting, and that sort of captures our digital journey.
We former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz and I had the honor of visiting with Justin in his technology data control center. If you haven't seen it, it looks a little bit like the screen of the Starship Enterprise. It was unbelievable. And the folks running it were able to answer every one of Ernie Moniz's questions. It was like a doctoral dissertation being evaluated. And he was particularly impressed with a young woman who, as Ernie was a professor at MIT for many years, and she was an MIT graduate, and she just kept hitting those questions right out of the ballpark. It was a lot of fun, a very significant learning experience for me, to be sure.
It reminded me of law school.
Justin, you have really a unique customer base in New York. What are some of the innovative things that you're seeing your customers do with respect to energy efficiency and renewables, and anything else that's on your radar screen?
So a couple things. One is, I think, almost across the board, they all want to better understand their own energy infrastructure, and they want to know, how can it be improved? How can it be made more efficient? And so that's all about, data gathering and sharing. And so that's where the NIAM part of our digital focus is helpful. But what we're doing is we're basically helping them develop master plans for their facilities. Again, these are usually a large governmental, scalable campuses, what have you, governmental campuses or collection of buildings. So we're developing these master plans that include their energy efficiency and how improvements can be made. We sometimes develop distributed energy resource plans for them. And we have 40 plans now underway. We hope to do another 15 next year for governmental entities. And so all that is going into the sort of collective resources that Jan was referring to. And along those same lines, we're working with, just about to launch a virtual power plant program for some of these customers, where we can hopefully utilize like a software aggregation platform in order to take all the resources that they have on a particular location, whether it's vehicles, solar, demand response, all those things collectively come together, and they can use that to serve their own load. But the interesting thing about that is that under FERC Order 2222, they can now participate in the retail and wholesale energy markets, so they can actually sell back and monetize some of their energy production. So we're very excited about that as well, rolling that out hopefully to customers. This is something that's going on across the industry, but we're utilizing it in our unique way with our unique customer base.
Thank you, Justin. Great presentation. Our final panelist is one of my favorite thought leaders in the energy industry, Paula Gold-Williams, and she will be our cleanup hitter today. Then we will move to our lightning round questions and hopefully questions from the audience. Again, reminder to use the Q&A feature on our screen. And Paula is the chair of the board of the Keystone Policy Center. She is the immediate former president and CEO of CPS Energy in San Antonio, which is the largest combined municipal electric and gas system in the United States. And Paula's won, as with each of our panelists, too many industry awards to be able to list, but some of my favorites, just before the pandemic kicked in, I was honored to join her in New York, where she won the Trailblazer of the Energy Industry Award issued by Global Platts. I'm messing that up, but it really one of the more prestigious awards for our industry. She has been named San Antonio's Woman of the Year. She chaired their Chamber of Commerce. And Paula, you and I discussed having you be the cleanup hitter so that you could really comment on the observations of that have been made by our other panelists and by our SHOD. Also, we've talked many times and featured you on our on the social equity pillar of our think tank when you were at CPS. You were the only female African-American CEO in the utility industry. So can you talk to, and we've heard Arshad talk about resource adequacy issues, especially impacting Texas. Can you talk to us about those issues and also comment at will on your perspective on social equity needs and issues in our industry?
All right, well, absolutely. Thank you, Clint, again, for, as Christine said earlier, being at the forefront so we can have these conversations. We had a great conversation last year, but wow, what has transpired over the last year has been just so interesting. So here you are again. You've put us all together on a great panel, and appreciate that. You're exactly right. I have in the past as well been a member of EPRI, and love the fact that we were able to kick off this session today with him, talking about this journey that we're on and how really 2030, in terms of energy planning, is just right around the corner. But it's doable. A 50% reduction is extremely doable. And you've heard from Karen and Rob and Jan, and from these technologists, strategists, leaders about technologies really coming together, and we can get there. I would basically say Justin and I have kind of, we actually have two different aspects of the way that we run our utilities. We're both municipal, but he does some different things in terms of serving the state of New York, and versus in Texas, where I am, we're primarily focused on San Antonio, and we do some wholesale business to the rest of the state. All that to say, I want to talk really kind of practically about where I think we are and what our challenges are. I really do believe that the key to our evolution is the ability to harness innovation. Super exciting watching Rob talk about spectrum and all of the work that he and his colleagues are doing in terms of how can we use that to enhance what utilities do. And we can talk all day about the technology. And in this group, right, this is the group of believers I love the fact that you're making so much progress with networks and communications and putting together clients who are able to move forward very strongly. But I also live in a state that experienced Uri. And it really was an emotional journey for the citizens of San Antonio and the Texans. What we did is we had the experience of really feeling what a lack of resource adequacy really can feel like when you're really being pressured by a real major event in climate. When you look at it technically, we use all these complicated terms, resource adequacy. What we're really talking about is, do we have enough capacity to serve the customers that need power? But we try as great professionals to plan for these peak times. When do we need peak? And Texas has been absolutely known for having a summer peak. But what Uri did in the middle of our short winter, I mean, Texas has a very short winter, is really increase the demand for power beyond anything we had seen in summer historically. And so you're not only planning for a general season, you're really planning for these unknowns and combination of unknowns. We experienced more demand for power. That demand for power caused us to have to force outages. We got instructions from ERCOT. We must take outages to customers. And it got to be so big here in Texas that we couldn't even rotate them. And that's what caused the challenges where we had people out for days, some of them 5 days. And it was a horrible experience. And so right now, I would tell you, the state of Texas has a tremendous amount of anxiety trying to make sure that we know that we're ready for this next winter. And I think based upon the current technology that really can't change a whole lot in 1 year, I think we are really coming together to try to give a lot of confidence to our citizens that we are running our plants as hard as we can. We are fine-tuning them. We're coming out of a period of increased maintenance, higher levels of maintenance. We have very much enhanced how we do weatherize our units. And I think we're about, we're collaborating extremely well. But the unknown, again, is how extreme this storm will be, if there is one, how extreme the weather and the cold frigid temperatures will be. And even more than the depth of how cold it will be the duration of that, in experience. How long can it go below freezing and really almost close to zero, which again is something that is highly unusual in Texas, but we did experience it. So practically resource adequacy, it is, again, we have to think about the terms of how do you really talk to the average citizen about this? Citizens, their tolerance for what they expect. And Jan talked about customers have preferences and they're driving how we're supposed to be investing more in cleaner and new technologies, but they also have a level of anxiety around how do we serve them. And when you think one more time about another dimension about how many people are, from an economic standpoint, still being plagued by the pandemic and the economic challenges of the pandemic. And if you're serving a community that already has a high level of poverty, and San Antonio has a fairly high level of poverty, and you think about that complexity and you think about the digital divide that really exists here. So we're talking about all this technology that we need to put in place, but the average citizen doesn't have that awareness, doesn't have that comfort, and may not even have that level of access. So I still believe that we have to think about how we are communicating, not just technically. And I think that the comments about the technical communication things that we can do that are happening are key. How do we make every single system, as Jan says, connected? Every single system interoperable, even when it wasn't designed to be connected in those ways. How do we make that an optimization? But how do we, again, create common language to our public to make them aware of the things that we are doing today, make them aware of all the things that need to happen, talk them through how important it is that we do have the alignment of funding at the federal, state, and local levels. I am just, keeping my fingers crossed about the Build Better Back funding model and whether or not we can get that passed. That is absolutely critical. Individual communities can't find enough resources and keep bills affordable enough to increase the pace and the velocity of how we're going to have to implement change here. And so again, that conversation has to be a lot more engaging. It has to be fundamental. It has to be less about big words and complex words. And we're going to have to move fluidly between what we do in the industry from a complex standpoint to, again, how do we convey it to the average citizen and elected officials and policymakers about how can we make this all work and need that support that collaborates with what we can do with the funds that we get from our customers. I guess the last thing I'd say again about the issues of social justice and energy or energy justice. The additional complexity that most utilities have is we're not dealing with, the starting from scratch, the greenfield side. If we were all trying to build and design a system from scratch, I think we'd have a whole lot more freedom. But we are really moving from infrastructure that's already in the ground, already complex. The transition from one system to another really kind of sometimes is overwhelming for a community to think about that and whether or not it's a great investment from that standpoint. But we have to think about it still in terms of still driving and giving them more and more solutions. And really, again, thinking about the people who you wouldn't normally be able to reach. My successor, Rudy Garza, is spending, I think, a really incredible amount of time trying to go out and do a lot more outreach, a lot of pop-ups, a lot of education, really trying to be in senior centers and community centers and different places in all aspects of our town, not just one. And when we partner, more than ever, talking to our partners about don't just come to San Antonio looking for the quickest economic benefit to the customers and the industrial and commercial customers who are at the forefront of being able to drive that change. Think about your cities holistically and making sure that you are sharing that investment even in your poorest part of your towns. That area, those areas of town, again, I come from those areas of town here in San Antonio. There are people who need that help. They need energy justice. They need access, and they need energy to be a bridge so they too can continue to help us be part of the economic development aspect of jobs and all of those things that make floating all boats really critical and effective. So those are my big broad comments, Clint. And again, I want to thank every member of this panel, those who are still here with us and those who have had to jump for other complications, because this is a hot topic. And let me see what kind of questions you think we need to also address.
Well, Paula, you have covered so many critical points, and several of them I really want to reemphasize because we are encountering them at a very real level in locations, not just working with CPS in Texas, but New Orleans, in Louisiana, both of which suffered from these intense storms and where there was tremendous suffering. We have talked carefully about communications as an infrastructure issue. You have raised it, the importance of communications in terms of talking to the people you serve, and that we all serve in one way or another. One of the discoveries we have post Hurricane Ida in New Orleans, post Storm Uri, is that people in the community simply didn't understand some of the communications. They were so complex. We had in New Orleans, the utility was reciting MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operators, technical jargon and load shedding and terms like that, and capacity alert, things that the average citizen just can't understand, absorb, and relate to. So one of the recommendations we have seen and been making is the importance of changing community protocols and the way we talk to people. You also mentioned broadband. I think in San Antonio, at least a year ago, I think it was 20 to 30% of the population did not have consistent access to the internet. And in New Orleans, it was closer to 40%. And these are very, very high priorities, but it really impacts communications at every level and social equity type of issues. And I love your term energy justice. I haven't heard it before, but with your permission, I will adopt that with attribution.
Yes, sir.
So Paula, you expressed optimism that we will be able to decarbonize quickly enough. Will we be able to decarbonize quickly enough with the level of resilience that you feel we need?
Well, I mean, in my mind, we have to, but I don't think it's, nothing's easy about this, right? So, Karen's comments about the return on resiliency and how do you calculate it and make it work, I think is extremely, she's right. It's hard for a utility to make it always work out. We have spent here in San Antonio more time talking to large businesses, commercial customers, industrial customers, partners of the water company here, to talk to them about a shared partnership focused on resiliency, and then connecting the work that we can do together with microgrids and the technology around making sure that you're not just putting in one solution set, that you're putting in a full solution set. In other words, yes, you want to look at it with a lot more renewables, as Jan said, but you got to have firming capacity. You got to have those batteries, and they have to be optimized, or you have to have some other technology, hopefully clean, that will make those microgrids a whole lot more effective. A utility cannot easily solve all that, by themselves. And if they do, as Justin talked about, typically you're talking about a small project. What we need is critical mass. We need to be able to take things to scale. And on the resiliency front, I think it's going to be, I like to think about things more as agile, right? You gotta go after some big nuts. You got to get people to share it. You got to think about, as Rob talked about, these communities and partnerships and systems, but you got to think about it all the way through agilely. But ultimately, what I like to explain to businesses when we're trying to talk about why they need to find dollars themselves for microgrids and resources is the more resilient and the more independent and the more that you can isolate your demand for power, it allows us to, again, go back and deal with the customers who have the least control and the least resources, and spend a whole lot more time taking those extra efforts to communicate with them and find ways to couple with them on how to be helpful. And then maybe the last piece I'll talk about is you also have a huge important aspect of your community that are basically shut in. They could be tied to their homes because they're on their ventilation machine at home or something, critical care customers. So again, the more that you can get the people who are most able to step up and do the things that they need to do, particularly in terms of resilient architecture, investment, and funding, the more you can take those other resources that you have and help those who have the least and need the most care.
Yeah, and Clint, to add to that, people think that these distributed energy resources, are a threat from a resiliency perspective. I actually think they're an opportunity. And then there's technologies where you can actually isolate parts of the distributed network, if you will. It's something that my utility does in South Florida. When there's a hurricane coming through and there's a flood, they can isolate certain parts of the grid. So that's one part. So I think the distributed side, actually, there's an opportunity to provide more resiliency. And this is a really silly example, but I think we're going to see that at scale. I remember this picture of, I think it was in Texas, Paula, of this Ford 150 person owner that during a storm had actually the cable back into his house to provide electricity. And again, that's a small, silly example, but imagine you can do that at scale with fleets or with the bus fleets that we spoke about. And then the back to the renewable fuels. We need the renewable fuels because heavy industries and agriculture are really hard to decarbonize with full electrification. Winters heating for long winter periods of time in the state of New York is really hard to do that 100% electric. So we need that for that. But then renewable gas will also provide that resiliency because you can stockpile it and you can make it available for those times where you need it as well. So that's why renewable fuels will add to the resiliency of the overall system as well, Clint.
Yeah, and I think that's not a silly example talking about Ford 150s. I think that's a terrific example. I think that will be a game changer in rural America in particular. And when you look at the potential applications of having that level of storage that can immediately be deployed, I think it will be, and the technology is coming along right now. So that not just for Ford 150s, but all electric vehicles. Well, let me suggest, we're getting short on time. Let me suggest we move to our lightning round, and I will just reverse the order a little bit. I'll start with you, Paula, then Justin, then Jan and Rob. So Paula, in just a few sentences, what's the most important theme that you would like to convey to the folks that have tuned in today?
My big objective is to make sure that people understand. You've heard a lot of different aspects of different things that people are working on. It is going to take a portfolio and diverse solution set, a lot of people solving problems from every perspective. And I would just say that we all have to have the intellectual curiosity to be open to all of these ideas and support them. They're needed. They become the huge ecosystem of success that I think very much Rob was talking about.
Thank you, Paula. Perfect. Justin?
I think as I was thinking about it and listening to Paul, I think the use of what we already have is so important. And I'm thinking about transmission and the rights of way that we already own and how difficult it is to site, build new transmission. So creative public-private partnerships around utilization of existing assets as we look to build out the system with all the new technologies, but paying special attention to what we have and making the best use of it.
Really vital point. Jan, you're up.
Yeah, a little bit along those same lines as Justin mentioned, cross-sector approach. We see large-scale deployment of funding and solutions because we need skill. I agree with Paula in cross-sector approaches. For example, Department of Defense is a huge entity. They're responsible for 1% of the carbon emissions in the US, 1%. Department of Defense working with their ecosystem, including their utility providers, including the manufacturers, on building decarbonization, on fleet electrification, and on the huge utility assets that they own and operate themselves or use from utilities. That's, I think, where we get really acceleration of decarbonization. So this cross-sector approach, if we can make that work, I think it's going to be really powerful.
Truly so. Rob, you're our cleanup hitter on the lightning round. You've got a hard act to follow.
That's
And
for sure.
I do have a question in the Q&A section for you when you finish.
Sure, happy to. And I just got to agree with all my panelists, Paula, Justin, and Jan on the important points. Just really adding in, summarizing, I think what Arshad and Karen echoed about that a modernized grid does require modern communications, and that, for us to meet all of these important goals, including the decarbonization, we have to approach it, I think, as Paul was talking about, critical mass and scale, and we have to take holistic approaches, collective approaches to these. Just yesterday, the announcement by EEI of the Nationwide Electric Highway Coalition is just a great example of that again, right? Seeded by, I think, Ameren and AP and others as it snowballed, but now under EEI's guidance is becoming a nationwide effort. And the scale and scope that's created by making these problems that all of ours and collectively approaching them, I think is the right way. That's what we're doing at Antarex for the communications leg of the stool, to make sure that we integrate all of these individual private network efforts into this nationwide network of networks, and just sharing that expertise, the aggregated market power, the scale, scope of that, and driving innovation.
Thank you, Rob. Let me turn to the chat. There was a great question posed, anonymous questioner. Rob spoke about developing separate communication systems for the electric grid. These systems would be designed to minimize opportunities for cyber attacks. Has thought been given to preventing hackers from embedding themselves in these efforts during development and playing the long game?
So I think, I'm not sure where the question came from, but that is always a threat, right? And I don't claim to be the cybersecurity expert. That's why we brought together this ecosystem of companies under our Antarex Active Ecosystem Program launch of this cybersecurity initiative. That is one of the threats, right? The ability to have contractors working with key utilities be the weak point of the link. And I think it's the sensing, the understanding of who has access. And really, this is not a utility problem. This is an IT, OT problem that's happening for enterprises across the globe. And so for us, it's saying, how do we create the scale to get the attention of these brilliant, innovative technology companies to help utilities put up the necessary moat around this? But as I said earlier, there is no silver bullet. This is a continuous process. And that's why we're focused on building a system that continues to innovate and drive and stay ahead of the curve. But that is one of many threats that we face. And that's why it's important to put together the coalition that we have.
Thank you, Rob. Great answer. We're just about out of time. I'd like to invite Christine Scanlon to come back on and video and close us out. Before she does that, I just want to say that this panel and Arshad's presentation were really phenomenal job by everyone, including Karen, who is now back at her own conference. Wonderful, wonderful job. We're so honored to be able to have our think tank do this in coordination with the Keystone Policy Center. And I think I heard Christine say that we had a very wonderful session last year at about this time as well. And I think we should just make this a permanent feature of, and I see Paula, our chairman, nodding her head. We should really do this going forward. It's such a rich, great discussion, great way to close out a year in which, Paula, you're absolutely right. There have been so many developments unimaginable in the past 12 months that what a perfect time to begin to discuss them. Christine, would you like to close us out?
I'm just in awe of all of the discussion and these speakers today, and grateful, Clint, for you pulling us together. I echo Paula's remarks, and this should be an annual event. Let's make that happen. And gosh, maybe someday we can even be live and in person. Just an option that I'd love to see, but I'm just very appreciative. Rich discussion, really important work, important issues. So thank you.
Thank you for making it so, Christine. And congratulations again to all of our participants. Really wonderful job today. And we wish you a safe and happy afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
Glenn.
you, Christine. Thanks, Clint.
Wish everyone
Thank you.